You are listening to the Modern Life podcast. My name is Tabby, and my returning guest today is Jason Sauer. We are covering the movie Arrival and the short story it was based on. We will be talking about the use of time travel in narratives, our experiences learning foreign languages, and also touch on some of the scientific concepts in the film. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at modernlifepod and email us at modernlifepod@gmail.com. You can find Jason on Instagram and Twitter at Jason R. Sauer, and I want to thank him again for being on the show. Alrighty, welcome back to the Modern Life podcast. I have Jason here with me. How are you doing today, Jason?
Oh, doing well. You know, I got some extra coffee in me due to our time zone snafu, so I'm pretty awake.
Yes, Arizona does not do daylight savings time, which is the right decision.
Truly a progressive state that rivals California in every way.
But Jason, what is your modern thought today?
I'm probably like most of the country right now in that I keep thinking about Andrew Cuomo and like the pressure for him to step down. Specifically, I'm kind of entranced by his really incredibly awkward and painful advances on people, which are totally inappropriate, but beyond that, also just make it seem like this guy has never actually dated anyone.
Wait, I don't know anything about this. You have to enlighten me.
Oh, man. So you remember like when the correspondence with like Trump, or not, I think it was actually just Trump reporting on it, where he was like asking women if they wanted to go like furniture shopping, and that was like his pickup line.
No, I missed that.
Well, okay, yeah. So Trump was just like, yeah, you want to go buy a couch with me, basically, and that was like his big pickup line. And then women were supposed to like fill in the gaps, and like, oh, I guess he wants to sleep with me then. Like it's just that kind of level of bizarre. Like this was your sort of come on. Well, Andrew Cuomo is pretty similar to that sort of situation. I mean, he's a terrible person and so forth, and I hope he resigns, mostly for the fact that he covered up the like thousands of deaths in nursing homes and then wrote a book about how good he was at handling the COVID crisis.
I didn't know he wrote a book.
Oh, yeah. He wrote a book that was published over the summer.
Do we know if he actually like sat down and wrote it, or he got some ghostwriter to...
I mean, this is always the question with any politician writing a book. I haven't actually looked into whether or not it was like heavily ghost written or anything like that. But yeah, it was called American Crisis, Leadership Lessons, and the COVID-19.
Kind of funny.
And yeah, so what you do when you have a pandemic is you lie about the number of deaths that you have, and then you proceed to try to sleep with several women in your office by saying, I miss hugging people, like really hugging people. And there you go. That's how you beat COVID.
Oh my gosh. I'm like glad I missed all that. It's like making me angry.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, again, his like move is talking to women about missing hugs. And it's like, have you ever spoken to a woman? Like, I don't understand like how this ever worked for you, other than just the fact that you've like accumulated power and like maybe people are vaguely attracted to that. But like if I was a nobody like me, if I were to talk to a woman about how much I miss hugging, I don't think that would get me very far.
No. Well, it works for this guy. My modern thought is also kind of about politics. Within the last year, 2020, during the election cycle, and then also during the white supremacist riots on the Capitol, I heard this phrase a lot, like in the news, from politicians, from from like educated people, that they kept saying like, America's the greatest democracy, it's under attack. And I just kept hearing this greatest democracy phrase over and over again. And after a while, it kind of, like a few warning bells started going off. First off, because like Americans are very like culturally comfortable with declaring themselves just the best, like that. That'll always be a little bit of a yeah. It's always like a little bit of a. It's just jarring coming from Germany, where that kind of language is really looked down upon. To like put yourself above other countries. And then also another thing that I was like, I don't know if the US is the best is it's a winner-takes-all democracy. And a country of this size and population has to be defined.
And diversity, yeah.
Yeah, and diversity has to be defined by either Democrat or Republican, which is it's just wild to me, just looking at how many people there are and how geographically how big this country is. And then another reason is the US owns territories where people have little to no voting rights. Also, gerrymandering and voter suppression exists in this country, and the electoral college process and how votes are counted in the U.S. has also been brought under scrutiny. So these are just the things floating around in my head, and I tried to look it up. And The Economist, it's a private UK company. It's called the Economist Intelligence Unit. They come out with a ranking of democracies every year. And I will say there's criticism because there's a lack of transparency as to how they determine these rankings, but it is the only thing I can find. In 2020, the US came in place 25, number 1 being Norway, and North Korea being at the bottom. So that's still awesome, but you're number 25. It's not necessarily the best. So my modern thought is just words matter. And I think if you just are blind to all the issues that you face as a democracy, there's no way to go up. So I don't know. It's just a phrase that I got really tired of hearing.
I had a couple of thoughts as you were talking about that. So number one, the idea that like Germany would kind of look down upon that sort of language. And like the funny thing is that theoretically, like America does too. We have all this controversy about like touchdown dances and things like that, like in showboating and sports, which is usually just veiled racism in the United States. But, there's like a lot of white people who are like, act like you've been there before, like none of that. But meanwhile, we're fucking spiking excuse my language.
No, you're fine.
The football and doing a touchdown dance because we did democracy so well and making sure everyone recognizes it. So it is this like weird sort of controversy. So like, what does Germany actually say about themselves? Like, what does German national pride look like?
And honestly, I didn't grow up with any of it until whenever the World Cup was in Germany.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was 2006, and just seeing flags everywhere was such a new experience. And I think it kind of reinvigorated that sense of maybe we can be proud of something again, and you don't have to live with shame for like all of eternity. Not that it's not important to know your own history, but just when I came here, people would say these phrases all the time of like, "Oh, America's the best country," and like if you said something like that in Germany, I think people would be pretty shocked. At least when I was growing up. So it is just a different culture, and I'm not saying that there's necessarily like a nationalistic idealism behind that. I don't think people are trying to be, evil or malevolent when they say these kinds of phrases, but I think it's still just important to be aware of what you're saying, I guess. But
Number 25 though, also I think that rating's really funny. Like how much difference is there between the lower tier countries? Like North Korea's on the bottom, but what's really the fundamental difference between them and whoever is like 3 spaces above them?
Right. Right. I guess that's part of why there's some criticism as to like, how do they determine these, these rankings? I mean, this
is like music ratings, like, okay, so what's the difference between like a 4-star and a 4.5 star, really, fundamentally? I'm always curious. I should look up those metrics too. As a professional scientist, I'm always curious about the methodology and these sorts of things.
That is totally legitimate. But I think we are ready to move on to the main topic, which is Arrival. I'm just going to give a brief summary. So the movie came out in 2016 and was based on the short story, The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. The film, directed by Denis Villeneuve, was a box office success despite its long and arduous journey to get made. The narrative follows accomplished linguist Louise Banks, who's recruited by the American military to establish a form of communication with extraterrestrials who have landed on Earth. There are 12 alien vessels who have appeared all over the globe, forcing different countries to work together to crack the so-called heptapods' language and understand their way of perceiving the world. As the days pass by, global unrest and fear of the aliens increases, causing paranoia and a disruption of the intercultural network of researchers and scientists attempting to share their findings with one another. The more familiar Louise becomes with the heptapods, the more she begins to think like them. Their language is nonlinear, and so is their perception of time. Louise starts to get glimpses of her future life, specifically of her daughter Hannah, who will die of an incurable disease. Louise's proficiency with the heptapod language also enables her to stop the wave of mass hysteria just before the 12 spaceships disappear, having done their part in imparting their gift of their language to humanity. In the end, Louise decides to have her daughter despite knowing the grief at the end of the journey, trusting that the joy of their limited time together outweighs the inevitable heartbreak. My first question to you is, when I rewatched this again, I was scared of the heptapods. Like, they're always so creepy to me, even though, like, I know they're chill, I know they're friends. And I was wondering, when you first watched this, did you have that same reaction of, like, that eeriness?
Yeah, for sure. I saw this twice in theaters.
Oh, wow.
When it first came out. And then, yeah, I think I saw it on my own, and like a bunch of friends were going to it. And I was like, yeah, I didn't really get that movie. Or maybe I did, but I don't know. I felt like I was missing something from it. Honestly, I didn't think the film was like that good when I first saw it, but I was like, everyone loves this thing. It must be me, you know? So I went and saw it again. But yeah, no, they're eerie. Number one, they're not human-like in their structure. They like emerge through the smoky background in the glass or whatever. I would say that the only major difference maybe is that I love cephalopods like squids, octopi, cuttlefish, and things like that. So I was very excited to see an alien that didn't just look like a human. I always think of like Worf or something from Star Trek.
Right.
Where I'm like, oh, it's just like another person, but he's got like a weird forehead thing. No, I think they did a really good job with like, they're kind of menacing, but like the menace just comes from the total unknown.
Yeah.
You know, like these are aliens. We know nothing about them.
Yeah.
They don't seem to be aggressive, but they're inscrutable.
Yeah. That's funny that you caught on to that, because when I looked into this, we were just discovering all these sea creatures, and that's what they based these aliens off of, which I guess I didn't make the connection, but you did right away. So yeah, they are, I don't know, I think you're right that there's just something so otherworldly about them. And I mean, that's the whole point of the movie, right? Like, don't judge a book by its cover. You know, we don't know anything about them, yet people are already starting to be really afraid, which I think that's accurate. Like, that doesn't happen in the short story. I think people are pretty chill, like, talking to these aliens. But man, just looking at COVID and other world events, I'm like, people would be losing their shit and like...
And I think it's very much a reflection of they're projecting like our nature onto the aliens, you know, like why would we go visit another planet? It's not because we would just be like generally curious. It's because we're hungry for resources. So we automatically assume that that's the motivation for everything else in the universe, or certainly a very likely potential motivation, because that's the lens through which we view space travel.
That's interesting that you bring that up, because that was an early draft of the script, apparently, because they had to find a reason for the aliens to be there for the movie, which that isn't really a thing in the short story. But one of the first ideas was that Earth is running out of resources, and the aliens are helping them, you know, find another planet or something like that. And the scriptwriter, I guess they rejected that idea because they just really didn't like sending a message out there of like, oh, we've effed up our own planet, like let's go to the next planet and do it all over again. So yeah, I'm glad they scrapped it.
Yeah, I've got plenty of other comments, but I'll save it. And
go ahead. You said to me that you thought the short story was so much more kind of like quiet, right? And not as...
So, okay. Yeah. I mean, talking about the specific motivation of the aliens, the difference between the book and the movie, or the short story and the movie, is it's never clear what the aliens actually want. They kind of show up and like they're repeatedly asked what do they want, and they just explain we're here to observe, and then they disappear shortly after the main character develops a sort of deeper understanding of the language, such that she's starting to kind of unmoor herself from the present day a bit. After that happens, they just kind of disappear, and then everyone's just like, what was that about? And it's really unclear. Also, like the aliens in the book are a little more puckish in a way, where like they do interact more with the people. I don't know. They seem to be able to tell that humans are like trying to extract information from them, or like, you know, some sort of glimpse into their advanced reasoning and technology and things like that. Because I think they mentioned in the short story that there was a breakthrough where the aliens finally, the heptapods finally impart some sort of complicated physics information to people, and then it turns out that it was actually very recently published already in like a journal in Japan or something like that, which I thought was really funny, because like they finally got something out of them, and it's just the aliens, you know, are like doing the Google Scholar search for like recent articles, and they're like, oh yeah, here's something interesting, and then it's our own stuff reflected back at us. Like they're totally inscrutable in the book. I don't know. I thought that was much funnier, and like, I don't know, they were almost charming in a way in the book that they weren't really in the film.
Yeah, I think it's just really hard to make a film out of that, because the tension and the drama is something I really loved in the film, especially the final conflict, which there's none of that in the short story. You know, there's not the evil Chinese general, you know, trying to start a war with the aliens or anything. But I thought that was a really clever thing to come up with for a film, because nobody's gonna, I mean, this film already took so long to get made, because every time the scriptwriter would try to like pitch it, like, it's about linguistics, like, you know, people, you know, producers are like, is there like lots of gunfire and shooting? And like, he's like, no. Yeah. So yeah, I think they did the best they could with trying to make it into a film.
Yeah, I don't heavily dislike the film or anything like that. I think it was really good for some of the reasons that you said there. And it is really funny thinking, you know, like this was a short story published among other short stories that might have had like higher drama and things like that. So you're not like, you know, you're not being taken for a ride, or not expecting to be taken for a ride in the same way that you would sitting down for like a 2-hour film from a large studio or something like that. So I appreciate that they did try to inflect it. But I still think it's more charming that just like, who knows what they wanted, man? You know, like that was like, she even forgets the language in the book as well, which is very different than what she does in the film, where, you know, in the later parts of it, she's like writing a whole book on speaking heptapod, you know, theoretically teaching everyone the language, and then I guess theoretically changing everyone's perception of time and progress and things like that. But in the book, Louise just forgets it. She like forgets most of it and kind of goes back to her normal life. She kind of like sometimes speaks it with the other researchers who are speaking it. But it's not even like they gave her a lifelong gift or whatever.
Right.
The aliens, the heptapods came. They kind of changed a few people's minds, you know, like maybe a dozen or something like that, the number that were actually studying the language. And they're like, okay, well, guess we're going. Thank you.
I think the short story is also written so brilliantly, the way it switches back and forth between experiences Louise has in the future with her daughter and her present work with the aliens. Same as in the movie, there's that moment of the zero-sum game where as a reader, you're kind of seeing things actually collide. And I thought that was another really great change that worked in the short story, but maybe not in the movie, is the fact that it's a mystery to you who this daughter is, who this child is. Like, you think this is something that happened in the past. You think Louise is dealing with all this grief, and then you find out later on, like, oh no, these are glimpses into the future. And I thought that was quite clever to do for the film.
I think this is part of the reason why I watched it twice in the first place, was I had a really difficult time kind of understanding the film edits, or I don't know, like they just didn't sit as well with me. But like after reading the book and seeing it in text, I don't know, maybe I'm just not a very good visual processor or something like that. But, you know, reading the text, then going back and watching the movie was like so much more coherent to me, and probably would have been like a very different experience the first time I watched it. So I really wonder how other people perceive this, like if they just had the movie and no other context for it. Because for me, it was like disorienting, and I didn't like, I don't know, it was very strange. But like going back and watching, I think it was really cool. It is like much more of a mystery where it's just like, where are these visions? Like you go through most of the movie assuming that she's remembering a child that she had in the past before the start of the film, or before the start of the heptapod events anyway. And so I thought that was like a really good element as well. Like it's a puzzle within a puzzle as you're watching the film, because you start getting hints that this might not be something in the past. Yeah, I would agree. I think it was like good storytelling, especially once I had, my brain wrapped around it. But I even remember even the first time watching it, I was like, no, that was awesome. That was really good.
Yeah, that was my experience with it when I first watched it. Like when the twist comes of her saying, "Who's this kid?" It totally worked on me. I was like, what? Like I was getting confused, but I wasn't putting the pieces together, especially when she says like that her husband was a scientist, and you see her getting closer to Jeremy Renner, and I'm like, so does she only date scientists? Like, this is weird. Like,
Yeah,
but
right.
but then you kind of start to figure it out.
Another quick comment regarding Jeremy Renner's character, or the difference between, oh my gosh, I've totally blanked on his name, but the physicist that Jeremy Renner plays in the film
Is it
versus the
Gary or
physicist in the
Ian?
book.
Yeah.
Ian, yeah. I love how in the short story that Ian is kind of insufferable from a linguistic standpoint, because he uses the term highly weird or something
Yeah.
to describe, which is a disgusting term, and a complete abuse of the English language. And like she notes it, or the author notes it as, being something that kind of like sticks in the linguist's mind. And I thought that was kind of a funny thing. Because like in the book, I was like, there's no way a linguist is going to end up with someone who says highly weird and thinks, it's like a doctorate of like language ends up dating like a Reddit poster or something like that. It's just like, and then, he ends up being charming enough for her to be like, fine, I'll date a Redditor. That's cool.
Talking about the science in the short story, there was
Mm-hmm.
so much hard science in there, which I
Oh,
think
yeah.
is really, really fun when you have, because I think I do a lot of like science fiction watching and reading that's like just
Mm-hmm.
totally out there, and having a lot of actual science kind of worked into the story in a way that could almost seem plausible, especially with the stuff involving time. And like the short story even has like little graphs in there of,
Yeah, yeah.
how does light travel through water, which like if that hadn't been in there, I would have been so lost. So I don't know, it's just a really smart short story. I guess it's really enjoyable at the same time.
I don't know if I've mentioned this on the show before, but I do have a Bachelor of Science in Physics. I am not good at physics, though. That's why I don't do that professionally now. So this was like touching on principles that we definitely had discussed over the course of that degree, which at the time, like the math was too difficult, or I just wasn't in the right place for it, where I was just like, I gotta go. I cannot do this for the rest of my life. So I kind of appreciate some amount of like physics and science in fictional stories, because like I feel like the understanding is kind of advanced, like even beyond what we understood when I was getting my undergrad over a
Oh,
decade ago now.
interesting. Wow.
And so like kind of getting the cultural understanding of physics instead of just like the straight mathematical sort of understanding. So I really appreciated that. And I went back and actually looked this up. I don't think they really touch on this much in the movie, but it's like a really critical sort of conception of like how the aliens think. And I guess it was also majorly influential on Ted Chiang's. Quick note. I learned a good chunk of Mandarin because I lived in China for a year, and I cannot figure out. I think he would pronounce his name Ted Chiang and not Ted Chiang. And I think it's because of prefacing Ong with Chi kind of changes it to Chiang, but I don't know. But a major irritating point in the film was referring to the Chinese leader as General Shang, because that sound does not exist in Chinese. It would
Oh,
be General
interesting.
Shang. And I was like, come on, man. Like, there's one Chinese guy and everyone's like, Shang. And I wanted him to say his own name. He's like, yes, I'm General Shang or something like that. Because
Right.
I just wanted them to have, I wanted them to really be like, oh no, it's authentically Shang. They would never call him that. Sorry. Anyway, so like I guess the basic principle here is, with the light diagrams, it's kind of the discussion of how light travels the most time efficient path, I think is maybe how I would summarize it. So, you can get from point A to point B, even just walking, thinking about that. You can get from point A to point B by just going in a straight line, or you can do like go up a block and then come back down a block or something like that. And to get to point B, there's infinite pathways to getting to point B. But in all cases, light would choose I'm quotations around choose, light would travel the path that is the most efficient. And so they kind of get into the idea of light has to know its destination in order to select its path, which is kind of an old understanding of it. Like choosing or selecting is not really something that is actually happening. And actually the physics are like much more complicated, but it was like a useful tool in sort of thinking about or in sort of conceptualizing how like the aliens think and how the language works and things like that. So I spent some time like actually going through the physics in terms of the Wikipedia pages to see, I'm like, okay, so obviously it can't choose, but what is actually happening there? And it is too complicated for me to relate in this podcast. Also, I probably couldn't do it with any sort of real accuracy without some further work.
But that's interesting that something like this science fiction short story made you look that up, because I had the exact same experience, because I used to be kind of into linguistics as like a hobby, nothing serious, but a lot of the terms used in the short story, I would, look them up, like what does glottographic mean again? Like what is a language-based writing versus an idea-based writing? Because I did learn this all at one point. And actually going back to what you said about Chinese and Mandarin, I saw somebody, I think it was a review online, but somebody mentioned that they thought it was really strange that the Chinese wouldn't have figured out the language first, because their language is or their writing system is pictorial and conveys ideas instead of conveying the alphabet like English does. That was a really interesting point, just in the way that you read, because from all the Japanese that I've now forgotten too, like reading in Japanese was so fast because you're not reading the alphabet, you're just looking at pictures basically. So reading a sentence in Japanese would take me like half the time than it would reading something in English. And just remembering back to that, I was like, oh, that would make more sense that, those types of cultures maybe figured it out a little bit sooner than Louise.
Yeah. Number one, I'm glad you mentioned that with Japanese, because that was my experience too when I was learning it, where I was just like, I took it for a year and a half in college, I think, and then studied abroad in Tokyo at one point. It's weird how your brain really starts reading it like much faster. And, like if you say that out loud to someone who doesn't like speak Japanese, it sounds like a weird flex that you're doing. Like, yeah, I can read Japanese like faster than I can read English. Like just get out of here.
Right.
Don't come at me with that stuff. But it's true. It's weird. And because of the way like Japanese is written, so my favorite example of this is the symbols used for email, because it's a combination of three that if you read them individually, you would be like, what is happening? So email is the combination of the words electric, child, and male. So electric and child together mean electron. And so there's like three ways to read email, basically. There's electric child male, there's electron male, and then there's email, like when you combine all three. So when you read Japanese, you have to like pair symbols together in order to like actually understand the meaning. And it sounds like that would be a much more difficult process than it actually ends up being when you've reached some degree of fluency. And I never approached anything like, total fluency. Like you really do kind of start flying on that.
It became so much easier once we started getting into the kanji. And I was always so intimidated by it. Like, oh my God, we're going to learn all these thousands of characters, and we only my level, we only made it to like 200 characters. That's like all I knew. But still already. And then there's that weird thing that happens where you might see a character, you know exactly what it means, but you might not know how to pronounce it. Because your brain hasn't made the, you know, like I know what this means and I can tell you in English, but like I don't remember what the sound is for that symbol, which is fascinating.
Yeah, which totally wouldn't exist in a language like this.
Where
or, you know, even in hiragana or katakana, which are entirely like phonetic
alphabets,
symbols. I mean, the post that you read about, like, it's strange that like China and Japan, or, you know, specifically China, I guess, wouldn't have figured it out sooner. It's funny because also when I was watching the movie, I was like, the weird and sudden aggressive reaction by China to like immediately launch into war. I was like, I think in reality they would be like, oh no, we got it. Like, you know, just like, no, we understand the language and all that. We figured it out way before all you dum-dums. Like, yeah. I don't know. I just thought that was like a really funny and sort of strange thing.
Well, that was something that I don't know if it worked or it came across, because listening to a bunch of interviews with the screenwriter, I mean, the whole movie is about miscommunication and not understanding other people. And he wanted it to be like, how do our preconceptions of our cultures on Earth, not even just the aliens, you know, influence how we see them making decisions? So he wanted like Russia and China as this enemy, but then when you actually, you know, when she actually meets the Chinese general, he's a totally, you know, he's a gentleman, he's a nice guy, he's intelligent, so he wanted to kind of flip those stereotypes and turn them around. And I am not entirely certain that worked all the way, though I really appreciate his intent behind it and trying to break some of those stereotypes. But I feel like especially Russia really still comes off as like a villain in this film, and I don't know.
It's tough because they also balance that with, I mean, so okay, I'll say my initial reaction is pretty in line with just like, oh come on, like China immediately launches into war, like Russia or whatever. Where you know, in terms of Hollywood screenwriting, I'm like tropes, you know, that sort of thing. But they do balance that. You know, the Americans tried to blow them up first, and it was like a small radicalized cell, you know, these like troops who you see in parts of the film, like listening basically to like far right extremist like webcasts.
Which is so weird that's literally what just happened. Like how many of those rioters were like ex-military or...
Yeah.
That's really scary.
Yeah. They're like listening to it on the, you know, at their post, and their superiors are like walking around and presumably like seeing it as well and just being like, yeah. So I would say like the China and Russia thing felt like sort of a trope, but I thought it was really well done, that it was definitely America that, you know, flipped out first on them. And it wasn't even the higher ups. It was just like radicalism within it. Yeah. I mean, that doesn't necessarily excuse the sort of Russia or China trope that happened with it, but I think he's not nice or forgiving of like Americans either. There's no depiction of like, there's no idealistic depiction of Americans in this. Like, yes, it should be the United States that leads the effort in this sort of communication or whatever. It's just kind of like, oh no, there was like just the right person who happened to be from the United States, but otherwise, you know, these ding dongs would have tried to blow them up and like totally miss out on the heptapod language.
Just another thing that I thought was really clever, that's a difference between the short story, just going back to that, and the movie, is that Louise doesn't really have a choice in the short story about her daughter. You know, it's a pretty preventable rock climbing accident, but she kind of, it kind of just all plays out, even though you do see the future. And for the film, they wanted to make it clear that it's not like fatalistic, like she can decide not to have Hannah. And she makes that decision just to have her and spend that, you know, those few years with her. And I thought that was a really important and impactful message that the short story obviously didn't need to have. Like, I'm not trying to pack all that into a short story, but I don't know, it worked for me in the film.
I wish I had time to like go back and read the short story again before this. There are some key differences, and this is why I would have gone back and read that short story to like tease out the specific differences between their conceptions of time between the two. But I don't know. I kind of thought it was relatively similar because I think like when Louise figures out or starts kind of getting this non-linear vision of time, I think they talk about her, like you can see the future and, you know, like, do you do anything to effectively change it, or do you delight in it, appreciate it as it's happening? It's tough to figure out what their real take is on determinism is. Like, it's kind of like, well, what if you did know the future? Like, would you really want to rob yourself of all the joy and the experiences that you had with like your daughter, regardless of whether or not she dies young, or for that matter, her experiences with the world? Would you really want to deny her that joy, or the world the joy of like having your daughter in it? And so I think like the movie just kind of hinges on, I don't know, I guess they are kind of the same. You know, like it seems to hinge on whether or not she would choose to do that or not. But I would say like the book kind of does it too. And they both are just like, I would rather have my daughter in my life and in the world than not, ultimately.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, like in the movie, they really emphasize that Jeremy Renner's character strongly disagrees with that and divorces her basically because like he's like so shocked theoretically at the fact that she would go through with that kind of choice, which I guess he feels is unethical or monstrous or something like that, enough to like break him up. And it even fundamentally changes his relationship with his daughter. Like the daughter complains that he has left her in spite of the fact that he really hasn't, but it has more to do with like his behavior has changed.
Which that relationship between Ian and Louise, I think it's such a wonderful romance in the story. Like you're really rooting for them, and there's no like make out kiss in front of the sunset or anything like that, but you know, them just supporting each other and him stepping in front of her when the guns are pointed at her. You like, it's a moment of like, oh my gosh, like these people really are kind of meant for one another. And then when that moment comes later that we already know that, you know, when she kind of like collapses in his arms and is like, oh, I know why my husband left me. And he's like, oh, you had a husband? And she's talking about him. You also kind of can see why he would make that decision. Like there's, you know, you kind of feel so heartbroken for them, yet it's another one of those choices where she's like, my time with this person is valuable enough that, you know, I will take the heartbreak that follows. So I thought the movie juggled that really well tonally.
I think their romance is really beautiful. I was thinking though, I'm like, okay, so, you know, if I was Jeremy Renner in the situation and somebody knew the kid that we were about to have, like if we have a kid, they're going to like die young or something like that, would I be mad that I wasn't told? Like this person has privileged information about the ultimate fate of a kid. Like, would I be really upset if they hadn't told me? And I'd be like, I would certainly be shocked. And I don't know.
I think I would be upset because you don't have that knowledge. You don't have those visions. You have nothing to compare to all this wonderful time that you get to have with this kid. Like if, you know, if ahead of time you would have been told, you probably would have said, oh, well, then let's not have a kid. You know, but she already knows what's coming. So I feel like that's maybe why she doesn't tell him.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why she hasn't told him, but I was like, would I divorce my wife, you know, or my partner or whatever if I was the person in that situation? And, you know, it would be really shocking, I think. You know, even beyond whether or not you still fundamentally like the person, I don't know. I can just see myself being like, I gotta step out of this. Like, you know, like I'm consumed with thoughts about this suddenly.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and like they seem to have like a good relationship otherwise. You know, even like past the divorce, she's not even mad at him really. She's just kind of like, oh yeah, no, I accept that.
I want to go back to the Chinese really quickly because when Colonel Weber hands the phone to Louise and is like, do you speak Chinese? Like, I feel like they just take it for granted that she would, just on the fact that she's a linguist. And I feel like
Yeah.
every linguist watching is like, the linguist is not a polyglot, like, you know,
Yeah,
people.
right.
So I was wondering, what did you think of her Chinese at the end? Because I've heard that it sounds like somebody who's just rehearsing a line. It doesn't sound very authentic, but I don't know.
So I would say that I have to compare this. I think the standard for bad Chinese in all film, for me personally, was, I guess it wasn't even film. It was on the Daredevil series, you know, from the Marvel comic universe that was on Netflix.
Oh, yeah.
And they had this one older Chinese woman who I guess was, you know, doing something.
Oh my
You know,
God,
was
wait, and wasn't Kingpin like trying to speak Chinese?
Yes.
I think I saw that episode.
Yeah. The Chinese actor definitely speaks Chinese.
Right.
Kingpin and the actor who speaks Chinese back to her, you know, to kind of flex, like, you know, I actually know what you've been saying the entire time. I'm not, you know, as ignorant as you thought. His Chinese is so bad. And I'm like, did you not get any lessons whatsoever? You didn't like get the Duolingo for Chinese pronunciation or anything? I don't think it's just part of the scene, but he looks so uncomfortable, like speaking it to her, like this is his moment of like revelation. And he's just like, you know, imagine like a middle schooler trying to say like, I like the dog or something like that,
right.
and just like butchering it. That was his level of like bad Chinese. I would say Amy Adams really gave it a go.
Oh, that's good.
I would say, sure, maybe it sounds like she got coached on it or whatever, but I was like, it's not perfect, but she's attempting tones, and she has a lot of the good pronunciation that would be lacking from someone who's just like, I read the page, you know, like
Right.
I know what the lines are. It would have been nice to have someone who was like more fluent or whatever, and I'm sure it was very distracting for someone who is like who speaks Mandarin.
Right.
But for me, I was like, no, that's not bad. There's worse out there. It could have been Kingpin.
It's so funny in those scenes. Like, I remember that scene because the sounds coming out of his mouth didn't sound like the Chinese language. And I hear that so often with like, I mean, obviously German, but even when actors are like speaking Russian, and I'm like, I don't speak Russian, but whatever came out of your mouth, like, did not sound Russian. And then I always put myself in like the shoes of the other actor who's like a native speaker and then has to pretend like, oh, like, I am so impressed right now. Like, oh, you showed me. Like,
yeah, right.
It's just always funny.
No, I was like, they don't even show, so in Daredevil when Kingpin is speaking Chinese, I don't think they even show the Chinese actor's face in the same scene.
Maybe she couldn't do it. She's like, I can't.
And I was like, I'm sure he was just like profusely apologetic for just like, look, I am so sorry for what's about to happen or whatever. But yeah, it's so funny thinking about like being that other actor.
Right.
And being like, yes, we are carrying a competent conversation right now. I'm not just queuing up, you know, my speech based on when you've stopped talking.
Right.
Or,
right.
You know.
Oh, that's so true. I also really love the decision not to subtitle the Chinese. So apparently this was kind of a point of frustration for the screenwriter because in the script it just said like she speaks in Chinese. And then they call him up and they're like, we have the person here who's going to teach, you know, the actor is Chinese. Like, we need to know what it says. And then the scriptwriter came up with that line of, you know, war doesn't have winners, only widows. And he's like, I came up with that, and now you didn't even subtitle it. Like, nobody knows what I came up with. But then in the interview, he was like, but it was in the end the right choice because what she's saying really isn't important. It's not relevant to the film. And I don't think I would have done that. I think I would have just subtitled it, not thinking about it. And I thought it was a really great decision not to do that.
That does change, you know, the sort of conception about it. And yeah, because I mean, like, you know that, so she calls the Chinese general, General Shang. Ugh. And I mean, it even sounds incredibly English saying it like, that long A just doesn't, anyway. She's calling him and reciting to him the words of his dead wife, the last things that she told him. So, I mean, it really is more about like, you know what's happening in the conversation. I guess it wouldn't necessarily be critical to know that sort of language. That is an interesting point, and I guess it makes sense in terms of the decision. I would say, though, that like after that point where she's at the party in the future, after he explains that and tells her the words that his dead wife or his dying wife spoke to him, he continues speaking Chinese afterward, and all he's saying is just thank you, thank you. He's going shit, 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 and
that's all I caught. I'm like, I know what thank you is. Go me.
Yeah, but they still caption it. So they don't caption it at all in the film, but like I had the subtitles on and it just says speaking Chinese.
Just like, interesting.
Come on, man. He's just saying thank you. It's not even unintelligible.
That's funny.
Yeah, the linguist thing is a funny point as well. We're just like, oh yeah, no, she probably speaks Chinese. She loves language.
Right. It's like, that's not how that works.
When in reality, it's like calling up a historian who wrote a book about the Napoleonic Wars or something and be like, what do you have on Russia under Tsar Nicholas? And it's like, I mean, like a bit, kind of more focused on this other thing.
Right.
Yeah, that might not have been a very good comparison. In my head, I was like, shoot, did Tsar Nicholas overlap with Napoleon? I don't know. I'm not a historian, man.
Well, the other thing about language in the movie is that quote that they have where Ian is reading from her paper or her book, and it says, language is the first weapon drawn in a conflict. That is a great line. Like, it's just so fantastic. Like, it's so true. And also, it kind of shows how he's a little bit prickly, because then he's like, well, you're wrong about that. Like, it shows his personality through trying to kind of be a little bit arrogant, but it's a great place to put your characters, especially because they're in this helicopter. I don't know if she's ever been in a helicopter. She doesn't know what the headphones are. Like, this dude is just, ranting at her about her book, and her ability to still be calm through all that and kind of go along with the flow is part of what makes her a really great character, I think.
Yeah, and that was a really good line. Those moments where, or like Amy Adams is like slowly kind of asserting herself and kind of establishing like, no, the work I do is actually like completely critical to all of this, like just as much as all this military preparation, more than the military preparation, because you're projecting things in the first place without really understanding intent or establishing any sort of communication. Yeah, that's like one of the many good character moments where this person who has, she's like lowest on the totem pole, they're just like, we just need to be able to make a phone call, which is a very basic sort of thing to do. And she's like, number one, it's really complicated to be able to communicate. And number two, like, this actually takes precedence over all of your stuff. And like Jeremy Renner or his character rather, Ian, tries to pull the sly line of like, actually the universal form of communication is science. And I was like, that's kind of preposterous even among physicists probably. Like, I'm sure there's some people who would think, like we launched equations. I forget which ones we engraved on the golden disc or whatever that we sent with the Voyager. So there's like some conception of like, well, we may not have common languages, but we probably have common mathematical conceptions or things like that. So to kind of like prove that there's intelligent life, we will demonstrate this like basic like principle in physics in a language that is probably easy to decipher by any other civilization that has sort of a language. But even then, it presumes that the other civilization is capable of language. Logically, you should already be kind of elevating language above other things and not assuming that it's actually math. But whatever. Jeremy Renner's character is a douchebag in the book, and he's kind of a douchebag in the film too in other interesting ways. But in the book, he gets more like humbled over time, where he's like he's trying to learn heptapod, and then later on admits like, yeah, I've totally given up on that. Right. That's way too complicated.
But I think also in the film, like the second thing he does is like throw up in a garbage can. And there's
he's the one who vomits.
There could have been a version of this film where he's just like the manly man, throughout, like the action hero, blah, blah, so.
Yeah.
I like that they didn't go with that. I had a question about the room that they came up with for the aliens, which I think is cool for a film. You know, because in the short story, the aliens are not actually on Earth. They're just like communicating through them through radio or whatever. But then they had constructed this whole room where they have to jump up, but then it goes sideways and they're in this, like you said, smoking room with the aliens. And when they first get in there, somebody looks on their watch or radio or something, and it's getting all scrambled and no signal is going through. But then later on, they're like recording everything and communicating with the people like in the tents further away. And somebody even says like, "Oh, are you getting us?" And the person, you know, operating the radio is like, "Yes, I'm recording all this. It's uploading to base camp, blah, blah, blah." So was that something the aliens just disabled the first time they were there? Or are there like different... This is like a totally random, like, doesn't have anything to do with the plot, but I was just confused as to when they were in that room and when they were cut off from other communication when they were not. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I totally missed any sort of complications with that. I mean, that whole room is just like, it's strange in general. I think they do a lot to kind of add to the disorienting effect of it. That wasn't really there in the book.
Right. Did that work for you? Did you like how kind of like weird it was and like...
I did. I really liked their presentation of the aliens and like, you know, behind the glass with all the smoke in it and things like that. I thought that was really well done in terms of like just kind of adding to, I mean, they have to stand at a distance too, because they, you know, they don't know anything about like the levels of radiation that are in there. Like everything is potentially dangerous to them, and like even the gravity is like different in there, and they have to like physically reorient themselves to even like go see them in the first place. So I generally thought like that added to the real foreboding sort of sense, or just like the spookiness of all of it.
And also the fact that she takes off her suit is like a big moment. I remember, especially the first time I watched it, like you're kind of like, what is she doing? And that you wouldn't have had that maybe without the weird room and setting the, you know, stage for it.
I guess they don't really establish that they've figured out like levels of oxygen, or, you know, even brought like a Geiger counter to figure out radiation in there or things like that. Which I thought
really?
was...
I think they only have that little bird in there in the cage, right?
Yeah.
But how much does that tell you? Yeah, I don't know.
But I guess presumably if the bird can live and breathe, then, you know, I guess I could take my cue from that and be like, it's probably safe for a human. The bird's fine. Yeah, but I totally forgot about the radio communication.
It's not important at all. I don't know why it just confused me. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I would be amazed. I barely get service in my apartment, which is not, you know, not whatever advanced material that the aliens are using. I just assume you wouldn't have communication except with like maybe someone who's standing directly down the chute or something. But I don't know.
Who knows? Another character moment that I really loved for Louise is when she tells the story of the kangaroos in Australia. So she says that kangaroo stands for like, what are you saying? Or it's a story about miscommunication between the colonizers and the people who lived in Australia. And it's not a true story. But that's kind of like how she gets her point across and gets her power in the situation, and then turns to Ian after Colonel Weber leaves and is like, it's not true. Like, that's made up. But just the fact that she's willing to do that or say anything, it makes us root for her in that moment.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she's totally powerless at the start. And then, you know, that's one of her many subtle flexes in terms of like, oh no, like what I'm doing is actually completely critical to this process. And it's taken for granted, but obviously communication is like the absolute necessity. I mean, that also has obvious ties to like thinking about colonialism and human reaction and like human use of language. Like we're trying to learn what all this stuff is ultimately so that we can control it and bring it under our purview and extract whatever the beneficial resources are. So I thought that was like a really smart tie-in to the colonialist history of language acquisition and things like that as well.
That's a really good point. I had a question for you because you speak a little bit of a few languages, and I've never heard, linguistic relativity talked about in a movie, but they do in this film, where they talk about the Sapir-Whorf theory and how
Yeah.
the language you speak determines how you see the world. And also, if a language doesn't have a word for a certain concept, you won't notice it as easily as when you're speaking a language that does have a word for it. I think it's generally widely accepted. I don't know who would kind of go against it, because I've had that experience, and every person to whom I've spoken who speaks multiple languages agrees with that sentiment. And so to kind of use an actual scientific theory to explain how she could see the future, I think it's brilliant, and it's another one of those like hard science things that works really well. Have you experienced that at all? That you're like, oh, there's a word for it in this language, and now I'm kind of more aware of whatever the phrase is or the concept, or...
It takes a long time, or it can take a really long time. It's not simply, like, what they're kind of describing here is not just like, oh, we don't have a word that distinguishes like raccoons from squirrels or something like that. To us, they're all the same. Like it's not something as dramatic as that, but yeah, like you have to become relatively fluent in a language to really understand like the feeling underneath it is distinct from whatever you would expect just based on the dictionary definition of a given word. And I think German, always gets credited with having like words for like hyper specific words for things that we don't have words for in English. Like Schadenfreude is like the classic, pardon me for butchering that if I mess up the pronunciation, but we don't have a word for that in English. It's interesting because like the feeling exists in English, but you can't like pin a label on it. That's kind of a case where the language just slaps a label on something that exists across languages, but you're kind of describing something more along the lines of you can't even really you can't conceive of things in the same way that people in other cultures do, because the language informs the thinking, and therefore, there's access to different modes.
Yeah, I don't know because I think that's considered like the strong version of the theory. That's something like if you've read 1984, like the Newspeak, the language that they invent in it to stop people from thinking of words like freedom and stuff like that. It's a cool concept, again, especially for like a book or a dystopian, whatever. But I think that might work if human thinking was language based only, but it's not. Like we think in feelings and pictures, and so language does inform part of that, and the words we use inform part of that, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's across the board, like, no, you can't think of some, unless you have a word for it.
I guess kind of an analog to that, have you ever listened to the Radio Lab episode about colors?
I think so.
Where they go into the invention of blue. Blue as a concept for colors didn't really exist until the relatively recent past in text. Previously, we kind of thought that authors were just being like colorful or metaphorical with language when they're describing like a yellow sea or pink skies and things like that. Yes, I have listened to that, yeah. But it turns out that blue just didn't exist across any text until a relatively concise period of time. And then after that, it appears everywhere. So questions about whether or not we saw blue previously, or if we were just putting a name on something that we all kind of noticed was about it, but having a word for it really solidified it. But I don't remember if it's in that episode or if they go further into it in like an additional web video they have for it. But there's this part where they talk about conceptions of color that differ among cultures. There's a tribe, at least somewhere in Africa, and I apologize for not knowing the specific location, it's been a while, that like separates or categorizes colors more into like dark and light, as opposed to whatever it is that we use to categorize colors, that allows them to notice difference in colors that we don't. By we, I mean like Western United States, maybe British as well. So I don't know. I think there's maybe something to it. Maybe not in the strongest form, but I would agree that language and, the way we communicate things definitely places limits on what we're able to perceive and conceive of.
The color thing is really interesting, especially because we still have some remnants of that nowadays, because we call redheaded people, their hair is kind of orange, but people had that color hair before we used the word orange to describe the color and not just the fruit. Because it's like a more recent addition to our color vocabulary, we're still stuck with calling them, redheaded, not orange-headed. Something like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, colors are really fascinating.
I think about that episode all the time.
Yeah, me too. I know the one you're talking about.
But yeah, I mean, the Sapir-Whorf thing is really similar. And there are definitely moments where, like with Spanish in particular, because I lived and worked in Chile for like a year and a half and really nose to the grindstone on the language, where there were these kind of like emergent sort of like understandings of like, oh, that's what they mean by this word. Like the dictionary definition is this, but totally different underlying sentiment for what they're really getting at.
This is like off topic now, but just that getting the feel for a language. One example that I found kind of difficult at first with learning English is like, why is when something's shit, it's bad, but when something is the shit, it's good.
Yeah.
Like, like what's the difference there?
Yeah. In high school, we had a Spanish exchange student he was from Spain. I don't remember which part. And we thought it was the funniest thing that there was no verb for to rock in Spanish. And we're like, how could you possibly understand what it is to rock you like a hurricane? You have this totally missed experience that is essential to being an American.
Without that word. That's so funny and also so true.
Obviously, he was just deeply annoyed. Like, he understands what rock was, but...
Anyway, yeah, you kind of touched on some of the last points I had here. Like, the fact that these Americans keep saying over and over, like, these aliens are being aggressive to us, yet they're the ones going in there with, like, bombs while the aliens are just, like, chilling. And I'm like, yeah, that's totally how it would go down. And, like, the ordinary person who kind of saves the world through being intelligent and kind, like, that, I can see that being the anomaly of Louise Banks.
And cautious is, I guess, the other thing. Cautious in a different way. Cautious in a generous way. Just like, I'm not going to immediately attribute malign, or like, not malign, but malicious intent on your actions. I guess I had one question. Did you ever read Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut? Like, that's a clear inspiration for a lot of this. There's an alien race in Slaughterhouse-Five called the Tralfamadorians who view time in the same sort of way. Like they can look at how things are over time as they're looking at a painting. They can see the right and the left side of a painting at the same time, which is, the beginning and the end of their life or whatever. I thought back to that story, with just this sort of conception of time, and I'm certain it's got to be a huge influence on this story. Kurt Vonnegut was like maybe the first author who, like, as an adult, I really liked. I've read plenty authors like through school and through classes or whatever, but Kurt Vonnegut was like the first person I really pursued his writing as a matter of enjoyment as an adult, because I felt like I was really getting stuff out of it. He gets criticized as being, like a relatively plain author. And I think if I was like a high-minded writer or appreciator of literature, I could understand where those criticisms are, but he's got some interesting thoughts, and he's a really kind and generous person too in his writing.
I'll have to check him out. Yeah, I haven't read anything by him.
Yeah, Slaughterhouse-Five is great. I'll have to find one of his other ones. Yeah. He wrote really beautifully about time too.
Let me ask you about that, because I think the concept of time and time travel, it comes up a lot in science fiction, and I think also even fantasy. And it's one of those tropes that really, really annoys me. Like, even in this film, I'm like, well, how could he have known that he had to show her the phone number and then this and then that? I think this movie's just so clever altogether that I overlook all that. But I'll watch something like when people were really into Doctor Who And my friends were
Yeah.
like, we're going to show you all the good episodes. And I like hated all of them because it's just like people running around. And every time I'd be like, wait, this whole plot doesn't make any sense. The doctor would like turn to the camera and be like, timey warbles, it makes sense
Yeah.
now. And I'm like, you can't just say that. And then your writing like works out, you know? Like, that's why I feel like when you're not going about it in a smart way, I think writers often use like time travel. Even in Harry Potter with the whole Hermione thing, I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Like, I don't know, it'll pull me out of the plot.
Yeah. I don't know. There's so many like physics things in general where I'm just like, whatever, you know.
Oh, I
like,
bet.
But it's,
Yeah.
it's weird. There's like, it's strange where like personal taste comes in, where you're just like, this is a tasteless use of time travel.
Right.
This is a tasteful use of time travel,
Right.
or something like that. Yeah, and I don't know. I feel like I'm just an insufferable, pretentious piece of shit about most things, so I have to accept that maybe I'm the issue in terms of like I can't deal with that. That's an awful use of time travel. I have a degree in geology, so like I look at a lot of movie sets and I'm like, what is going on with that? You know, like I think it was the Hobbit trilogy. I watched the first one.
Oh my God,
and, like,
tell me
all of that,
everything.
it was, and number one, it's a bad film in general. But number two, I remember like looking at the sets where I'm like, what are these rocks? Like, what is this supposed to be? And then I was just like, all right, it's me. You know, like who is really coming into a film and being like, sediment doesn't look like that. What do you? They would never layer in that way. Like, are these volcanics or these, you know, just insufferable. The only good use of time travel was in Star Trek 4, where they go back in time to save the whales. Also involving language, because the aliens speak whale, and all whales have gone extinct by the time of Star Trek's future. So they have to go back to like the early 1980s or something like that and go pinch a whale from
I barely
an aquarium
remember that.
or a zoo or something.
Well, but that was like a big hot button topic back in the day, like when we were growing up. Like, save the whales. The whales are going extinct.
Yeah, they're still not doing great, but yeah, no.
But did you have anything else? Any last thoughts on this film?
No, I mean, I thought the film was good. I would definitely recommend reading the short story. It's like, what, 60 pages or something?
It's so quick, yeah.
It's a quick read. And I think seeing the film, I expected it to be much longer, but it was fast and it was really touching.
Yeah.
And this is just me, though. I spent more time thinking about the text than I did the film, but I think the film does a really good job.
Something, just because you just said it about how touching it is, just because you just used that word, I think the author and also the film, they do a really good job of putting in the science, putting in the story, you know, the science fiction stuff, but not losing the humanity. And the only recent other hard science thing I read is The Martian. I haven't seen the film, but it's about this guy who gets stuck on Mars and he's, you know, figuring it out. And especially reading that book during COVID and having that dude experience like no loneliness, like he's chill, like he can just be on Mars without doing anything, like in his little tent. It was really jarring, and it was like watching like a robot that got put in. You know, the author was focusing so on the science and not on making like an actual character. And I felt like this movie or this short story never lost track of that.
Yeah, I would say that was I never actually saw the movie for The Martian, but I read the book. And that was my general criticism of the book as well, where I'm like, there's no humanity in a lot of this.
Yeah.
This is like a perfectly efficient machine trying to figure out how to, you know, and he like makes mistakes in it and stuff like that. But otherwise, it's just an engineer writing a story about what it would be like if things went wrong on Mars. Yeah, it totally loses that sort of reality of like being a person.
Yeah. I
actually had two roommates when I was living in Colorado who worked on space shuttle missions. They were getting their PhD and like figuring out like how do we send humans up there and things like that. So one of them brought home these strawberries that they had cultivated that were theoretically, a strawberry plant with these like little tiny strawberries that were really tough. That was a plant that they were thinking about potentially sending on like a Mars mission that, you know, has no intent to come home. And so they're really water efficient, but there's a lot of psychological elements to that too. like because you're stuck in a space shuttle and then you're stuck on Mars. There's no greenery whatsoever. And so like the plants are critical both for like providing your food, but there's a lot of psychological assistance that provides as well. I mean, like there's stories of people who work in Antarctica who basically go insane. It's really common.
Yeah.
And that's because there's nothing to look out on. You're stuck in this base that looks like it's, you know, like a Martian base or something. There's no plants to look out on. And so it really messes with your minds. And yeah, so I think the Martian really missed that, where I'm like, I would be going insane in like a week, like pretty quickly. Sorry, this is a long tangent.
No, you kind of participated or anticipated what I was going to ask you, because you did a really good callback back to our episode just now for Encounters at the End of the World. And then I was actually going to ask you about the last one we did was Dune, because this color palette that Denis Villeneuve uses in this film, it's not one of my favorites. You know, the dark, everybody is kind of gray looking.
Yeah.
It works so well for this film. There's some fantastic shots of just like mist rolling over the mountains, and I don't miss the color at all. But I think we were just looking at the recent Dune trailer, and it looks just as dark and black and colorless and that was our criticism of the original film, especially when they're on that like green planet. And I'm like, man, like I've only seen the trailer, but I hope he doesn't get stuck with this color palette for something as, you know, wild as Dune.
Yeah, I don't know. I live in the desert and it's beautiful. Sure, there is that dark color palette, but I mean, the critical feature of the desert is that the sun is always out. So there's a lot of light to really bring out some subtle shades and things like that. Yeah, the color palette in Arrival, I think, really worked very well for it.
Yeah.
And it's such like a murky process of just like, what the heck are these aliens? What do they want? And kind of adds to the sort of unease of it. But I really appreciated that sort of take on like space and stuff like that. Like even the aliens didn't use colors, you know, like it's gray and like gunmetal gray. Like those are the two colors that they used in their ship. In the book, they have 8 eyes. Who knows what colors they can see? But we were just left with like.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's it. I think we're done, right?
Yeah.
Alrighty. Jason, do you want to tell the people where they can find you online at all? Like on Instagram or Twitter?
So we're still doing the Future Cities podcast over at like Future Cities Pod, which is on Stitcher. It's on iTunes. I think it's on Spotify too. I forget all the places. I haven't done an episode in a while, but there's plenty of great collaborators who are on there talking about the current state and future of making cities livable and resilient to changes in climate change and extreme weather events and things like that. And other than that, please hire me. I'm graduating in maybe in late July, early August, and I need a job. So
a lot of science companies are going to be listening to this podcast, of course.
I can tell. A lot of engineering firms. That's great. Good to know. That's your key audience. You can find me on Twitter at Jason R. Sauer. That's Sauer. And then same for Instagram. If you need more doggos in your life, I've got one. He's very handsome.
Right on. Thank you so much for another episode.
Thank you.